All right, thanks, Margaret. Well, what do we have here? Let us see. Let us see. Let us see. Okay, we're going to finish up, hopefully, with blessing power. Meditations to bring you closer to God through mundane acts. And we'll continue our study of mindfulness and compare it to concentration. I'm just so joyful at all the different types of meditation we've covered with Rabbi Kaplan. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This is the eighth type of meditation. Sheesh, who says that Jews don't meditate? This is really incredible. Okay, let's get right down to it and see what Rabbi Kaplan continues to say about meditations to bring you closer to God through mundane acts. Let's take a look. Okay, a little bit complicated, very spiritual. Okay. Okay. He's giving us a logical, he's using logic to try to prove something which is not exactly logical, which is a kind of interesting technique. So he's basically saying, okay, God is one. That's the essence of the Shema. God is unity. There's no such thing as God and his this or God and his that. God is one. So um, we say that things exist because of God's will. So this book exists, and I exist holding this book, and you exist listening to me talk about holding this book because of God's will. So he's saying, this is in a larger sense God's will, this book, because God's willing it here. But God is one. So it's not as if you have God and his will. God and his will are the same. So that's how he's kind of logically saying this is God. God is manifest. But see, it's not as if God and then there's something to manifest. So he's trying to use a logical theory based on the principle that God is unified to get us, just like a Zen koan, it's like to get us to intuit, now I get it. He's trying to use logic to try to get us to appreciate the fact that the truth here is not really logical. It's an interesting technique from a very interesting man who's very brilliant. Okay, so why is he saying this? Because he's wanting us to get on the path mentally of trying to appreciate how different things are connected. So he continues along these lines and says, you're washing the dishes and you're concentrating on the act of washing, clearing the mind of all other thoughts. Notice that he's now mentioning that we have to employ a skill we learned in concentration meditation because we're focusing only on the dish and we're trying to block out any other thoughts. Okay, so we're using a meditative skill to meditate on the dish. So we're pushing aside any other thought that enters the mind, and the task at hand totally fills up the mind. We're just absorbed in this washing of this dish. So, okay, what of it? Is that all there is? No, because he's saying it's an expression of God's will in essence. He's trying to say, well, the God is behind everything. So all of a sudden, as you're meditating on this dish, as you're washing it, you're like, wow, this is part of the larger universe. That's where he wants us to go with this. Okay. And he's saying, this is how we can experience the divine in a mundane act by basically saying, ah, it is because of God the Creator that I'm here washing this dish, and this dish exists for me to wash, and we just had a meal and made it dirty, and now we got to wash it. Okay. So he's trying to encourage us to broaden our perception of what we're doing and realize that this one mundane act of washing the dish after dinner is part of the ongoing universe. Ah, very cool. Okay. This concept is manifestly more explicit in Jewish teachings regarding eating. It is taught that when a person eats, he should concentrate totally on the food and the experience of eating it, clearing the mind of all other thoughts. He should have in mind that the taste of the food is also an expression of the divine in the food. And again, he didn't do this, so we have to do this. We have to be mindful of the fact that he's not saying there's a piece of God in everything, in the food, in you, because God is one. So you have to take figuratively when he uses phrases such as expression of the divine. It's not like the divine and then his expression. It's God. Okay, whatever that means. Okay. A person can also have in mind that he will dedicate the energy that he will obtain from this food in God's service. It is taught that when a person does this, it is counted as if the food he is eating is a sacrifice on the great altar in Jerusalem. So this is where what we commonly call programming comes in. What's your mindset? In other words, you're sitting there eating. We know from experience as well as science that eating gives us some kind of nutrition and energy. So what are we going to do with that energy? Are you going to go out and just be a bank robber? Or are you going to go out and do a mitzvah type of thing? So that's another technique for bringing the act of eating into a larger picture, and a larger picture in which you have a relationship with God. How? Because he's instructed us in different mitzvot, and we're going to use the energy from this one single act of eating to do a mitzvah. Maybe we'll go visit somebody who's sick, or whatever, walk an old lady across the street, or go learn Torah. Okay, so we are using a skill we learned in concentration meditation, to focus on the dish in a meditation where we're thinking about the big picture of how one thing we do is connected to other things. And then at the same time, we're going to employ a third type of meditation where we think about our life. Remember, Rabbi Kaplan has talked about we think about how things are connected, and we think about our life and what we want to do about it. Let's just go over here a quick second. In Ruach HaKodesh, remember we taught in order to achieve enlightenment, we want to keep working on ourselves to develop certain midot, certain personality characteristics. So basically we become a good person, an elevated person. Okay, so we're always thinking about that. We don't want to stop thinking about that. So we're washing the dish, and we're really employing three different types of meditation at the same time. Again, the skill we had developed in concentration meditation to be able to focus on one object, a dish, the Ruach HaKodesh meditation where we're trying to develop ourselves and always do good things and develop good personality characteristics. And the third one where we're thinking about the universe and our relationship to it. So all this is employed, all these various types of spiritual pursuits, these types of meditations are employed in the mundane act of washing a dish. Okay. Therefore, eating itself can be a form of meditation as well as a means through which one can draw closer to God. It is for this reason that it was ordained that a blessing be recited before one begins eating. The blessing varies with each food, and a complete list can be found in prayer books. Each general category of food has its own blessing. So even if you don't always say blessings, you've certainly been at a Shabbat table. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, who brought forth sustenance, bread sustenance. It's not really bread, but sustenance from the earth. Okay. So who brings forth sustenance from the earth? He says the first thing that you notice is that the blessing is in the present tense rather than the past. He brings forth. Motzi, who is bringing forth, who are motzi lechem, who is bringing forth. The blessing, therefore, immediately indicates that God's creative power is in this sustenance, this lechem, right now, at the instant one is eating it. As soon as one has this awareness, the act of eating becomes an active communing with the divine. This is like a very subtle but very special point he's making. When we say the blessing, and we need to understand the words and blessings. There's translations in every siddur and so on. When you say, yeah, this is, I am aware that God is doing this, you have established a connection to God at that time, and you've elevated the act of eating. Right after we say Baruch atah Hashem, we say Elokeinu, our God. This indicates that he makes himself available to us and allows us to experience him. It is because of his immanence that he is accessible to us, and we can experience his closeness whenever we make a sincere attempt to do so. Okay, so once again, we have this paradigm of the great and wonderful God, master and creator, who's mine. So this huge, indescribable being that is our God. And when we get to Bhante, we'll also get some reinforcement on this idea of large and small, global and local type thing, far-reaching and intimate. Too much emphasis on God's immanence, however, might lead a person to minimize his greatness. One might even get too familiar with the divine. Therefore, the very next expression is the blessing, and the blessing is King of the universe. That's kind of an interesting question. What is he talking about? So if we're saying there's blessing over whatever food we're eating, when you say my God, how can we get too familiar with God? I mean, guys, it's really this unfathomable being. So how can you get too familiar? So he's not saying it, but I would guess that his answer would be that we make ourselves too familiar. We bring the idea of God down too much. Like he's my buddy, he's my buddy God. Maybe you want to take him for granted. Maybe you want to lapse into what Bhante would call ego states, get a little bit, is my buddy type of thing, a little bit too personal, a little bit too much that you think it's all about you. I think Rabbi Kaplan would say the problem with getting too intimate is that it makes it too much about you, which it's not. You're not the center of the universe. So I think that's what Rabbi Kaplan would say if we asked him, how can you possibly get too familiar with the divine? I think he'd come close to that. So Rabbi Kaplan is basically saying, don't worry about it, because the structure of the blessing is designed to prevent you from going too far with this familiarity with God, because the next one says King of the universe. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, King of the universe. Like, oh no, he's the King of the universe. Can't get too close. He's not really my buddy. He's the king. So that's very, he picked that up. It's a very smart design of the bracha to keep you in your place. We make ourselves aware that this presence that we are addressing is the same infinite being that rules all creation, the same presence that exists throughout the entire universe, in stars and galaxies beyond comprehension. Not even the Starship Enterprise can find them. When we say that God is king of the universe, we avoid falling into the intellectual trap of pantheism. We are aware that God's presence permeates all things, but we realize that this does not mean that God is no more than the sum of all things. We therefore say that God is king of the universe, which is, again, he's pointing out how the structure of the blessing, or the structure of the bracha, is designed to keep us from falling into intellectual or psychological traps. In this case, he's basically saying that, okay, we are intuiting that it's because God's will, God is willing everything to be. So therefore, one intellectual step after that we might take is, well, that means God's here and there, and that's God, and that's God, and that's God. He wants us to avoid falling into that intellectual trap by saying, no, it's the king, and he goes on to say this. Does he say it here? He doesn't say it here, but he has said in other places. Here goes. A king's power may fill his entire kingdom, but this does not mean that the king and his kingdom are one and the same. So we're in the king's land, but it doesn't mean the king's sitting here. It's his land. The king's presence is felt, so to speak, because his authority is manifest everywhere. His power makes things happen because he's king, but he's not like sitting next to you. So that's a good model. So similarly, when we say that God is king of the universe, it's his place, it's his rule that we're following, but it's not like he's right. He's not the book. He's not in the book. He's not in the computer. So same kind of idea. It's very clever. So that's a good take on King of the Universe. It keeps us from, first of all, getting too familiar with God, because you don't get familiar with a king like that. And secondly, it helps us understand that it avoids pantheism, which is God's here, this is God, this is God, this is God, this is God. Nope, 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 nope. He's removed, but his presence is here, so to speak. His influence is here. We then conclude the blessing in the appropriate manner. In our example, the conclusion is, Hamotzi Lechamin Aretz, who brings forth bread or sustenance from the land. Okay. That's what he does. We designate the food and make ourselves aware of God's creative power and immanence in the food we eat. Here's a little bit more on how you make the eating a meditation. The blessing should be said very slowly, with the mind cleared of all extraneous thought. When said in such a manner, the blessing before food can be a very powerful meditation. How many people rush through it? How many people rush through Kiddush? How many people rush through a motzi? But what you're supposed to do is say it slowly and focus on every word. Treat it, it becomes like, it's not a mantra meditation because you're only saying it once, but it's the same technique. You are verbalizing important ideas, and you got to focus on each one of them, each one of the words. Okay, that becomes a meditation. You can see how the whole act, from eating to washing, and the meditation everything becomes a meditation. People sometimes ask why Judaism does not have an eating discipline like many of the Eastern religions. We do have an eating discipline. Of course, we have one important eating discipline, namely keeping kosher. That's really big. Okay. An animal must be slaughtered in a very specific manner before it can be eaten, the blood, and how it's kept, and the whole kashrut set of processes. It's very elaborate and right up to your table where you're not mixing meat and milk. It's got a lot of moving parts. Certainly a discipline. Not eating certain species and the whole bit. The most important discipline of Judaism, however, involves the blessing. When a blessing is recited before eating, then the act itself becomes a spiritual undertaking. Through the blessing, the act of eating becomes a contemplative exercise. Just as one can contemplate a flower or a melody, one can contemplate the act of eating. One opens one's mind completely to the experience of masticating the food and fills the awareness with taste and the texture of food. One then eats very slowly, aware of every nuance of taste. When one eats with the proper state of consciousness, one can make do with a much smaller amount of food. The body's own wisdom determines how much food is required, and no more is desired since one does not eat out of compulsion or out of nervous habit. Therefore, one eats exactly as much as one requires, no more and no less. In general, then, Judaism sees even the most mundane acts as means of gaining God consciousness. Working, eating, dressing, all can be made into acts of worship. A person who does this can begin to see God in every facet of life. So he's ending on a super mystical note here. Okay. So he's defining as spiritual a taking a meditative approach, being here now in the act of eating. Excluding extraneous thoughts, concentrating totally on the act of eating, on the taste of the food, going slowly. And what's really interesting about that is in doing that, you're engaging. There's a body mind connection because the intelligence inside your body, which your mind is registering, is basically telling you, stop, had enough. And if you read in other sources, your body will also tell you really what you need to eat. I think that is really true. I think that if you didn't just, I love chocolate cake, I'm gonna have some chocolate cake. If you bypass that for a second, like what does your body want? Your body will pretty much tell you, I gotta eat meat now, or I need a little carbs, or I need something light. Whatever, I need something energetic, whatever it is. um, your body has an intelligence, and getting yourself into your meditative mind, you'll be able to pay attention to what your body's telling you. Remember, this is a hearing religion. We hear our messages. So therefore, and part of that involves listening to what your body says. Just as we said a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the Shema, when we say this, we say, "Hear Israel, Shema Yisrael." We're basically saying, what is God telling you through the occurrences of the world here? Similarly, we're using that hearing instruction to what is your body telling you? So the upshot becomes, if you are taking a meditative approach to, in this case, the mundane acts related to eating, you can have an outstanding spiritual experience that includes increased focus, um, feeling closer to God, enjoying it, and experiencing what you're doing to a deeper level. Um, and it's strengthening the body-mind connection, so you're more in touch. Having an increased awareness of what you're doing and its role in the flow of the universe. All this involved in mundane acts if we take this approach. And that is blessing power. So I think next week we are going to continue this line of thought and talk about how the commandments, there we go, getting closer to God through commandments and rituals. We're going to continue this line of thought and talk specifically about the mitzvot. That's an earful. Let's see how Bhante complements this. What is he talking about? Mindfulness versus concentration. Up this. There we go. Okay, what does he say? Vipassana meditation, and again, that is the meditation that we do to increase internal awareness of what's going on in your mind. They call it Vipassana. Just to go up here for a quick second. No. All right, mindfulness meditation, again, to make you self-aware. He said it's something of a balancing act. We're cultivating two separate qualities of the mind, mindfulness and concentration. Ideally, these two work together as a team. They pull in tandem, so to speak. Therefore, it is important to cultivate them side by side and in a balanced manner. If one of the factors is strengthened at the expense of the other, the balance of the mind is lost and meditation becomes impossible. So he's already starting out by informing us that there's kind of like a yin-yang quality to the meditation where we're overall trying to develop mindfulness, because we have to develop the opposite. It's so interesting. We have to develop the opposite of mindfulness, which is concentration, to help us develop mindfulness. He's going to show us how that works. Concentration and mindfulness are distinctly different functions. They each have their role to play in meditation, and the relationship between them is definite and delicate. Concentration is often called one-pointedness of mind. It consists of forcing the mind to remain on one static point. Rabbi Kaplan just mentioned this. You need powers of concentration to be able to focus on the dish and think about the dish and avoid thoughts about what you're going to do later tonight or tomorrow, whatever it is. That's concentration. It consists of forcing the mind to remain on one static point. Please note the word force. Concentration is pretty much a forced type of activity. It can be developed by force, by sheer unremitting willpower. There's a place for that. Obviously, there's a place for that. And once developed, it retains some of that force flair. You force your mind back. You are using a measure of force to go back to the breath. When we meditate at the end of class and we say, focus on your breath coming out of your nostrils, and you're like, oh, now I'm thinking about whatever. It's a forced action to bring your focus back on to the breath. Mindfulness, on the other hand, is a delicate function leading to refined sensibilities. These two are partners in the job of meditation. Mindfulness is the sensitive one. It notices things. Concentration provides the power. It keeps the attention pinned down to one item. Ideally, mindfulness is in this relationship. Mindfulness picks the object of attention and notices when the attention has gone astray. Concentration does the actual work of holding the attention steady on the chosen object. If either of these partners is weak, your meditation goes astray. So that's so interesting. So we're sitting there meditating, trying to focus on the breath coming in and out of the nostrils. And it's mindful that we're mindful of where the breath is. Then we're mindful that we've deviated and now we're thinking about roller skating. Mindfulness tells us that, and then concentration skill pops in and says, okay, I'm going to bring the attention back to the nose. Mindfulness informs the concentration. Concentration could be defined as that faculty of the mind that focuses single-pointedly on one object without interruption. It must be emphasized that the true concentration is a wholesome one-pointedness of mind. That is, the state is free from greed, hatred, and delusion, and so on and so on. Unwholesome one-pointedness is also possible, but it will not lead to liberation. Okay. I actually want to, this is getting deep, I want to save it for next week, but I'm going to give you an example of what he's talking about. So the meditation that we do in class, I told you, is something that I do in the martial arts training. It's mindfulness meditation, as we just been describing, but there's a prerequisite to do this. We don't get tested, we don't get really trained in this, in my discipline, until we master concentration. And the concentration exercise is to be able to sit down, and in your mind, count backwards from 500. But you have to picture the number in your mind and say it. All right, right now I'm like 500, 500, 499. I see it, I say it. To be able to do that from 500 going backwards. Okay. A lot of people can't do that right off the bat. It takes training, but that's the power of concentration. So Sifu said, you got to be able to do that if you're going to do mindfulness meditation. Why? Because if you don't, as Bhante just said, once you deviate from your focal point, you're not going to have the strength or to get back to the focal point. You have to develop the ability to say, no, I got to go back to this, and force your will there. So this counting backwards exercise and visualizing is a method to develop that skill. So it makes perfect sense. The concentration is under the employ of the mindfulness, but you can't, but you need, but the mindfulness is just giving you information. You need the concentration skill to be able to function on what you got to do. And in our case, it's to be able to retain, our attention on a specific focal point. All right, so we'll continue along these lines next week. But I think this is like really interesting. I hope you find it very interesting too. It's good stuff. Okay, Margaret.